Hi everyone and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us all wherever you are in the world. So we're here afternoon in the UK, but we're also joined, I know, by people over in the US. So really delighted to be hosting this on behalf of Social Chorus and Finsbury. The reason that we came together was it really seemed that there was an alignment around a lot of the conversations that we were having with clients and with contacts and with colleagues. Social Chorus, for those of you who don't know, it's a leader in workforce communication, and it helps some of the world's largest companies transform the way that they communicate with millions of employees every day. I work for Finsbury, a global advisory firm where I head the EMEA employee communication and change practice, and that's really looking at right around the employee life cycle, how we motivate, how we retain, and how we engage people around these moments of inflection. So why the conversation now? Well, I think what's really clear is that when lockdown happened, it felt like a crisis. And I think adrenaline kept lots of us going. And I'm sure we all felt that with late nights and hearts pumping. Businesses the world over were, I think, slightly shocked to discover that flexible working worked, that digital collaboration platforms worked, and that those who needed to keep working could. What's happening now is we're moving into a new phase. I think it's optimistic to call it post-COVID, but it is certainly a new world of working. So lockdown may be lifted in many places, but restrictions are still in place, and businesses are navigating yet more new territory. So it feels more complex than ever. The conversations that we've had with chairs, with CEOs, with chief people officers and directors of comms suggest that this is an issue that people are really grappling with. So from initially focusing on technology, the problems are now becoming more human. So how do we collaborate with some people together in a room and others still working online? What does good leadership look like in 2020 and in a world of digital working? And with many businesses committed to keeping offices closed and to keeping their employees online, how do they help manage anxiety, exhaustion, loneliness? How do you build culture? And also many businesses are still balancing furloughed and active employees. So how do you keep everyone engaged, supported and confident? So it really seemed that these were some of the key questions that people are asking at the moment, and a great time to have the discussion. So I'm really delighted to be joined by two experts in each of their fields. So Lucas Miller and Owen Service, experts in neuroscience and behavioural science respectively. I'm going to unpick some of the challenges. The questions we're tackling today are the ones that we've been asked over the past few weeks by people really facing these head on within business. And also, of course, we're joined by you. Thank you so much for registering and joining. We've got a really wide selection of people from HR, internal comms, strategy, ethics. So please do let yourself be known on the Q&A. You should see down at the bottom, there's a Q&A button, and we'll be taking those as we can throughout the conversation and then trying to deal with as many as we can at the end to make it as two-way as possible. We are also recording this session and that will be sent to you tomorrow in an email, which means you can watch again or share with colleagues. So I thought I might start just by kind of summarising some of the challenges that we think that businesses are facing. And I think it's worth saying there is no business that has faced exactly what we're going through now. We're hearing from quite a lot of our clients, what about these businesses that were really strong on flexible working and had great technology solutions in place? Well, none of those had them forced upon them 100%, or are now looking at a kind of 70%, 30% balance. So this is all new, and there's a chance for everyone to learn from one another, to share best practice and to get really good at it. So the key topics that we're trying to cover today are around remote leadership and behaviours, empathy, care and mental well-being. And I know for a lot of you there's real interest in Zoom fatigue, and we will be touching on that later. Effectiveness, productivity and burnout, moving away from 100% online working, as I just alluded to, and managing culture remotely. So before we move on, I thought it would be helpful, Owen and Lucas, if we just reflect on where are we today, several months after all of this started. So perhaps, Owen, if we start with you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Louisa, and really great to be here in this virtual seminar. So I just thought I'd start with a few more general reflections about what has happened over the past few months. And in particular, this notion that from a behavioural science perspective, it's worth remembering that human beings are creatures of routine and habit. and that these routines, these practices, they take time to form, and they require repetition in a consistent context to become embedded. So when they do become embedded, they end up being quite sticky. They're hard to get out of. So I'm thinking about things like the way that we travel to work, the way that we structure and organize projects. Basically, everything that we do in our day-to-day lives can be thought of in part as a routine practice. And what the psychology and behavioral science literature tells us is that one of the best ways of getting out of a bad habit is to disrupt the routine or the practice in some way. And so one thing that I've been reflecting on a lot over the past few months is that there has never been, for many of us, a greater moment of disruption than the one that we are currently facing in terms of those organizational habits and practices. And I think what we're going to see over the next hour or so is that we're going to get into some areas where actually the new habits and practices are quite positive and we want to maintain them. And there will be many others that Louise has already alluded to that are not quite so positive. And both of these areas, both the positive new developments and the negative ones, will need to be actively managed in order to either maintain them or to prevent them from becoming the new normal.
Sure, I'll jump in. Oh, and I agree with most of your points. I just have two questions really to add in terms of my general reflection and the pulse that I'm getting, especially from the States perspective. And that is that 3 months ago, almost everyone was asking themselves the question, how do we continue to work in the same way we're working now, but just online? We need new tools, but we're going to do everything the same. And the idea is we just need to hold out until the new normal or the better normal or whatever normal people are calling it. And now the zeitgeist has changed. Many folks are going to be remote until the end of the year, and they're starting to realize this may not be temporary. This may last so long that we adapt and we make too many changes to the way we communicate or work or IT, that this will become the default. And even if we want to go back, we may not be able to convince people. We may not be able to make it happen. So that shift has really happened, especially on our end in the last month. And then second, I would add, now is a time in history with what I call high variance. So there are many, many companies and individuals who are benefiting tremendously from this situation, actually. It's made their lives incredibly easier, opened up opportunities to spend time with family, do things they've never had time for. And then you have people who are struggling immensely. The demands on their time, attention, energy are basically exponentially increased, and there's so much lack of control. And in this time of high variance, where you have many people with many setbacks and many opportunities, it ends up presenting an opportunity for businesses where if you don't rethink everything and try to emerge stronger, then you're going to be left in the dust. That's really the challenge now. It's not sit back, get through. There's so much variance. And if we're not questioning the status quo, being intentional and rethinking everything because we're basically forced to, then we're going to end up in 6 months potentially losing 10 years of ground to all the other businesses who've jumped up on this opportunity.
Great. I think it's a really good point, and it's something that we're hearing from chairs and from boards as well, as they're starting to question what's the future of the workplace. And I think your point about people holding out, absolutely. I heard somebody say, we pressed pause, but we hadn't yet pressed refresh, and I think that moment is happening now. So let's start with what should business leaders be worrying about and thinking about when it comes to their newly online workforce? So perhaps, Lucas, you want to start, maybe if we start on the subject of trust, which we know is so important.
Sure. I mean, I have a million different aspects of businesses that people should be worried about. I mean, in general, when I jump into presentations, I love fear mongering. It's just a natural style that I have, but I'll focus on trust, Louise. I think that's a wonderful place to start. And I do think that businesses and leaders should be terrified about how to do this in a new context, because typically the way we build trust is actually neurochemical at baseline. We actually release a neurochemical called oxytocin when we interact with our family, our friends, other people who are gradually getting closer to us. And it's often through touch or prolonged eye contact, sharing personal information, much of which does not happen or cannot actually happen via a digital medium. So this is the chemical we actually need to generate trust. And it's difficult to find a way to do that and to promote a culture where people are comfortable sharing crazy ideas and giving feedback and not knowing how it's going to be taken. So in general, the challenge is, how do we build trust or release oxytocin amongst people in a format that doesn't make that really seamless and really obvious? And so there are a variety of different tips out there that people could implement, but I would add probably the most important tip is to not make things all business. It's so easy to jump on, I have 30 minutes or 60 minutes and jump right into the agenda. You're basically boxed in. It's very constrained, and you almost feel like I need to be formal and professional because of my posture. But to just take a couple minutes and get to know the people behind the screen. Otherwise, it's so easy to just treat them as, I volley work off to you, there's some psychological and physical distance, and never feel compelled to share personally or get to know each other.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think one of the key things we're missing is that moment before you walk into the room where you're in the corridor together. And one of the things that online meetings are doing is, as you say, they're bookending them very formally. So that's great news. Owen, anything to add to that? What should leaders be worried about?
I happen to also agree completely with Lucas on this one. I actually think more generally, if you take it up a couple of levels, that people forget about the importance of trust at an institutional level, but also at a national level as well. There are studies that have consistently shown for the past 40 years that the very strong correlations that there are between levels of trust throughout populations and GDP growth. And there's a very good reason for that, which is that trust lowers transaction costs, but it also encourages people to take risks. So that same phenomenon is true at the level of the firm. How do you get people to engage with one another, but also to take risks that will ultimately benefit the companies that they work for? And I completely agree with Lucas that actually one of the problems about the last couple of months and the new ways of working that we've adopted is that, ironically, given that we're all working from home offices and from bedrooms and kitchens, a lot of the meetings that we're having are of the formalized nature, and a lot of them, almost the most important meetings that we have within the context of the companies that we may work for are of that more impromptu, socially based, serendipitous type meetups. So the question, to my earlier point, is how do you curate and how do you manage that kind of transition in a world in which we're going to be working virtually? So one idea on this front is to actively encourage people to meet up, but to do that in a randomized way rather than people doing it through their existing networks. So you effectively curate serendipitous meetings that can take place online, but are very different from the more formalized, structured encounters that we're having on a day-to-day basis at the moment.
Yeah, and I think there's a really interesting point about that, which is many of us are restricted in terms of our offices, how many people we can bring back, how do we make that work, A teams and B teams. Actually, there's a whole world outside the office that might feel more comfortable for some people, particularly in the UK as we head into what we often call summer, and which may actually turn out to be a summer this year. But the idea of bringing people together more informally in outdoor spaces. We talked to a chair this morning who said it's likely that they'll encourage use of the equivalent of WeWork or sort of more informal working spaces to gather together small groups. Lucas, in conversation earlier, I know one of the things you touched on was the kind of informal social and how important it is for young people creating connectedness. And I was just if you could touch on that particularly, because I know as people start bringing in things like graduates and apprentices as we come up to September.
I'd love to jump in here. Oh, and you said something about meetings being rather formalized now that I wanted to build off of. There are absolutely two types of meetings now. There are meetings that are 100% agenda business, let's do it as efficiently as possible, and then virtual happy hours, right? It's designed, everyone knows the idea is to build connection back in, and maybe it's fun, maybe it's well run, there is a lot of variance there, but it's basically on two sides of one spectrum. Everything in the middle is gone. There's no working in the same conference room together anymore for an hour, where maybe you're doing the same project, maybe you're working on different things, but there's a little bit of a check-in, maybe a question. There's no onboarding where someone can basically walk you through something, and for the most part, you're just watching, intermittently checking in with questions. And one of the main tactics that I recommend, talking about trust and talking about culture and talking about meetings, and they're all really tied, is to build back in opportunities to work in the same room together. It seems actually unnatural and a bit oversimplified, but if you just get on Zoom or whatever video conferencing tool you're using and just have, I sometimes call it a focus sprint, but it's basically a joint working session where, you know, you check in, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? Or let's do the same thing together. And it brings some live real-time feel to an otherwise, everyone's on different timelines. It's asynchronous. We're all distributed. And I'm never really sure if people are working and what the pulse is. So that's one tool I highly recommend folks bring back into working with peers or people that they're onboarding, because it removes this meeting dynamic where it's me versus you or lower versus higher. And now we're on the same side of the table working as peers on the same project in the same direction.
And I think a lot of what that touches on is really about culture. In a lot of places, you kind of remove the sense of hierarchy from the fact that actually you can wander over to somebody's desk and you know that they're open. So, you know, I guess next big question to tackle is, how do you maintain culture when everyone, or perhaps even more difficult, the majority, is working online? So I don't know, Owen, if you want to maybe kick off on that one.
Yeah, and again, a really important question, and one that is related to that previous discussion around trust. But culture is another concept which we probably don't give enough thought and reflection to, because we sort of notice it when it's not there and when it's not present. But ultimately, it's what marks a successful organization, bringing people together around a diverse set of individuals, but unifying them around a shared set of values and goals. And again, that becomes more complex in a world in which people are physically distant from one another. I mean, I've been doing a bit of thinking around this, and I think one of the most important things that can be done in this area is to create a sense of reciprocity between and interactions between individuals in relation to the goals that an organization might have. And one particular focus of this that everybody is now going through at the moment is around ways of working in a post-COVID or a post-lockdown world, and creating that together, co-designing it in a way that then helps to build or rebuild that sense of shared culture together. And I think one of the things that's linked back to the point that Lucas just made in this at which is also important, is about the variety of the working day. So Lucas said, you know, we're at the moment we're all having two different types of meetings, but there is potential for us to just generate new ways of working that create breaks and break up the day through a normal working day that are likely to lead to stronger forms of engagement for organizations around the world, I think.
Great. I think that's it's absolutely true. And I mean, it's interesting because one of the things that I think organizations from a leadership level were quite afraid of before COVID was flexible working. The businesses that I'd worked with looking at how we implement flexible working, there were issues around, will it work technologically? Can I trust people to actually get the work done? And of course, the point we've made earlier, this kind of this disruption has shown us that absolutely yes. One of the other things that I think wasn't happening in the way that it could have been and probably should have been was exactly to your point, Owen, around co-creation and collaboration. I think there was always this idea that there's a group of people who do the creating and then we tell the rest of the people what it is. And increasingly, and particularly if you think about younger people, actually you're much more likely to buy into something if you were involved in creating and designing it first of all. And I think this is a really fantastic opportunity for people who, you know, who have that employee mandate to start advising on, look, if we at the top aren't entirely sure what it looks like, we've got this whole host of people who've been part of this great experiment that we can involve in more deliberately designing it. And I think there's this idea that we all kind of fell into it, and you talked about, you know, holding out for the new normal. And Owen, you talked earlier about kind of actively managing and deliberately creating a strategy. You know, this is the time to take hold of it. It would be great to see more involvement within businesses from people right down from the bottom. So moving on now in terms of the sort of the next big question that we want to tackle. So we've covered off a couple there, and I'm really conscious that we're we're relatively short of time. We're trying to do some best practice Zoom and keep it short. So we'll share this afterwards, but towards the end of this call, we're going to just pop up a poll to find out actually what are people really interested in, what are the topics that you want to be taking back to the business and talking about. But in the meantime, something that we've just touched on very briefly in this call and I'd like to explore a bit further is around balancing productivity and efficiency. So, we're hearing a lot about if you fall out of bed and your desk is right there, it's very easy to start working. Maybe the trust is now there and we don't believe everyone's sneaking off and doing their laundry, but what if we've actually gone a little bit too far in the other direction? So how do we balance productivity and efficiency with really positive mental health practices? Lucas, perhaps you want to make a start on that one.
Sure. I'd love to first start with why are we even asking the question? And it's that it's much harder to actually balance these factors when living and working in the same exact place. So for many people, it may not be the case anymore, but initially when we transition, our bodies go from being in person, having many boundaries, having a clear start and end to the day and breaks in between. We're now in a situation where our brain is completely confused. Our brains are actually systems of electrical activity that operate via associations and memories. And now if you're in the same space, potentially you've been in for years or decades, and you're trying to get into the same level of focus and productivity while you're seeing, your couch, which helps you couch, and your dining room table, which is associated with family meals and respite and restoration, your brain is actually electrically confused, not knowing which reinforced patterns to trigger and which ones to suppress. So for most people, I just want to say, if you found it difficult to adjust and you end up not being able to turn 100% on or conversely turn 100% off, it's okay, it's normal. Your brain is actually confused. And part of your job, once equipped with this information, is to become the architect of new associations that serve you, as opposed to the victim of ones that have potentially unfolded in an unintentional fashion. So that's the stage I see. And now the question is, how do you balance getting work done with being able to turn off and still having enough time and bandwidth for the rest of your life? And one of the key recommendations on the team front is really to embrace asynchronous communication. So that sounds rather abstract. It essentially just means things cannot be in real time anymore. We don't have the luxury of walking over and saying, hey, did you see my email? Or hey, can you chat right now? But most items do not need to be real time. If it's an emergency, of course, there's a customer issue, we're actively losing money, sure. And there should be a clear channel to reach people if there's an emergency. Otherwise, it's asynchronous. If someone is best at 5 a.m., they should be able to tackle something and keep making progress at 5 a.m. If someone is best at 10 p.m., by all means, give them some freedom to operate and leverage their unique biology. And that requires pulling back on communication practices that are often real time. I need things now. Hey, everybody, we're going to talk about this. Let's meet now. And find a way to systemize a way to communicate and stay informed, but not have it be always on the same timeline. And then I would also add one, just to move into more practical and tactical land. Every single business I've seen during this transition has experienced a change in how meetings unfold. And it usually happens in one of two directions. Meetings go completely down. No one's meeting anymore. No one knows who they need to meet with, or they soar. And you start to see more meetings being packed on the calendar because it's so easy to send an invite and request people's presence. Things that were an hour are now 30 minutes, and we just have double the meetings. So anyways, many companies that have seen this massive uptick need to do what I call a calendar cleanse, which is they all get together, build out time and space to assess what's changed in the last 2 to 3 months. Let's go through all of our recurring meetings, at least the ones we control, and assess, do we need 60 minutes? Could it be done in 30? Do we have some meetings where more people are attending than we need? Some spectators. There are 12 people and 5 people would objectively say, I'm multitasking for part of it. I only need to be there for the end. I could read the notes. Go through the list of how to reduce meeting load, because I promise you everyone has these challenges, but there's no socially convenient or diplomatically acceptable way of saying, we have too many meetings, let's cut these. It has to be a team effort.
Great point. Owen.
I completely agree. And actually, I think it's very, very interesting that there is actually a reasonably now well-developed literature around meeting that nobody seems to have ever truly embraced and applied in a systematic way at an organizational level. But meetings tend to have too many people in them. I think a good rule of thumb is no more than 7 people in a meeting, and ideally fewer than that. They tend to be too long. They tend to be set around calendars. So typically the average meeting is, guess what, 60 minutes long. And they tend to not be structured in a way that facilitates the desired outcome or output. So just one simple idea in this area that we use a lot is if you are having a meeting that is designed to generate new ideas, don't bring people together in the meeting to generate those ideas. Get people to independently generate ideas, and then use a shorter meeting time with fewer people to decide how to then take forward the best of those ideas. And actually, this relates to a concept which I think Lucas will have a take on this, which is more neurological based, but in the behavioral science literature, it's called choice architecture. Right? So this notion that it's quite difficult to, in a lot of these areas, to change the approach or the mindset of an individual towards a task, but it's quite easy to change the structure of the environment in which those decisions are taken. And I like to think about, in the areas that Lucas was just mentioning around meetings, around the structure of our days, to apply simple rules of thumb that reduce the cognitive load upon individuals to have to take decisions across the board, and that facilitate simple decision making that ultimately leads to improvements in our mental health and well-being. So one very, very simple rule of thumb that we can all apply is never have a 60-minute meeting. So what happens if you never have a 60-minute meeting is that you basically end up forcing yourself to embed breaks in between meetings that you put into your calendar, which tends to be governed by 60-minute slots. So if you have a kind of range of those sorts of rules of thumb, then and you do that alongside the kind of activity that Lucas was suggesting, which is you take a more strategic, holistic approach, then I think you ultimately end up in a world in which you're like fundamentally re-engineering the way in which most organizations work, or at least those organizations that use meetings to take most of their decisions.
Oh, I need to jump in here. Choice architecture is getting me really excited. And I have one other idea and suggestion I've seen on the meeting front to not change people's mindsets and just facilitate a decision that everybody wants them to make, but for some reason they don't make, and it's not necessarily bad, but just that's the behavior. And one is around meeting agendas. Everyone wants an agenda, but you don't always get one. And personally, now that we can't say, hey, everybody, get up, let's talk now. You need to request time. You need to be deliberate. You need to give advance notice, and you can't expect everyone to be there. There must be an agenda. No agenda, no meeting. But how do you get people to do that? That's a new behavior. Do you fix mindsets? Do you force it? Do you crack down and police everyone? One tactic you can use is many companies, especially ones that are 1,000 or fewer, have aligned on, what's the standard meeting agenda template? And you can remove things, but what's the standard? What should we expect? And you embed that into Google Tools or Outlook, such that if there's a new meeting, it immediately pops up with a pop-up window basically saying, fill in the agenda. There's a standard format. You can remove whatever parts aren't necessary. And when folks send out that invite and you get an invitation with the standard, what happens after is any future person, when they send out a meeting invite, what will happen is one of two things. They'll send it with no agenda, in which case, okay, I need an agenda. Or they'll send it with their own format, and then people will go, why isn't it the standard format? There's pressure then to go, oh, okay, I'm seeing the standard format go around. I want to also use the same tool. And you get a little bit of a trickle effect until the vast majority of people beyond the early adopters start to use this template. And it's embedded into the choice architecture, Owen, like you were saying, where we've made it so easy and frictionless and obvious to do something we all want to do and everybody expects, but for some reason just doesn't happen.
And the really interesting thing I think about, sorry, you can tell that Lucas and I really love the research on which may not excite everybody on the seminar call, but it should be something that we're all thinking about. The really interesting thing is that if you ask most people in most organizations whether they think that the meetings in the companies they work for are run well, almost everybody says no. The only person who tends to say yes in answer to that question is the person who chairs the meeting, which is what then perpetuates the cycle that we're all confronted with.
I think there's a reason why it's much more important at the moment. And actually, I love the idea of a well-run meeting. And I think in almost 20 years of consulting, I've seen that in probably 2 places. I'm not sure there's anyone from one of them on the call, but they have a great system. Input, process, output. What are we going to take into the meeting? How will we run the meeting? What do we need to take out of it? That sort of at least gives people a sense of direction. But I think right now, one of the reasons that it's particularly important that we run great meetings and that we use people's time really well is this point around engagement and this kind of sense of being purposeful and sense of achieving things, particularly because we're so dislocated. So actually, if you end up joining meetings that you find unnecessary, poorly run, disinteresting, that get in the way of the work you need to do and extend out your working day further into what you had hoped was your home time, it actually has, I think, a far more detrimental impact on people's engagement and kind of sense of well-being. And mainly, we're purposeful creatures. We like to contribute and we like to do well. And if day after day what you feel is that there is something getting in the way of that. One of the questions that's come through is around how we can sort of what action should individuals take for themselves so they don't burn out? So, if we've got 200% more work, barely time to take a coffee break, that it wouldn't be happening like this in an office setup. Even in terms of getting to meetings, you'd have to sort of get up from your desk and either walk within your own office or walk to somebody else's. So if you've got any kind of a couple of tips for people on this call now that they could start applying that might help them.
Sure. I can jump in with one and then hand it over to Owen on the burnout front. Everyone has heard of the concept of Zoom fatigue or video fatigue. It's 100% a real phenomenon. It is more draining to spend 4 hours versus in person just staring at a screen in a rather constrained, unnatural position, trying to decode lagged interactions and facial expressions of a variety of different people all presented right in front of you on a tiny screen. And so I just want to say, if you've experienced that, it's normal. It's not you doing video improperly. It's actually rather unnatural and highly cognitively intensive to process the exact same form of stimuli via this new method. So what you can actually do, these are tactics that I personally use every single day to reduce the drain from video, since I'm off and on for 2 to 3 hours a day. I'm right now looking at everybody. I have the gallery because there are people involved and I'm trying to read their nonverbal cues. That's often not necessary. You can often just look at the speaker one at a time. So if that's possible, just look at the speaker. Don't do gallery view. Second, if you don't need to be on video, if it's someone you already know well, it's a quick check-in, don't be on video. Actually, if your internet is bad in some cases and there's a delay, you will actually look less focused and less trustworthy than if you were just on the phone. So that if your internet is ever poor, immediately get off video, not just because of bandwidth, but because of how people will perceive you. And then lastly, the most impactful technique I could ever give people, and there's a funny analogy that goes along with this, but if you are on video, you can usually see yourself. Imagine how weird that is. Let's say Louisa and Owen and I are in a meeting room. Louisa's running the meeting. And we're all listening and she's doing a great job and she set up the agenda, but we just put a massive mirror at the back of the room so that Louisa, while talking to us and trying to read our nonverbal cues and get us aligned around some project, she sees herself and she's like, oh, how do my glasses look? How does my hair look? You can't look away. And that's exactly what video conferencing is if you're looking at everyone else, like in an in-person meeting, and you're looking at yourself. So I recommend everyone, unless you really need to be looking at your eyes and checking yourself out. Hide self view. You can just go to the top of your video on the screen, top right, and then click hide self view in Zoom, for example. And that way your video still goes to other people, but you can't see yourself. You don't have the situation, which is rather unnatural and highly draining, where you have a mirror up in the room and you just, I promise you, if you see yourself, you're going to be drawn to it, and it will drain you throughout the entire call.
It's great advice, and from one of our early conversations, it's absolutely the gift that you gave me. And the other thing is, I think it's, yes, like a mirror, it's tempting to sort of look at oneself, but I think for anyone who's been through training around things like active listening, you know, you start thinking, am I actively listening? Do I look like I'm actively listening? So yeah, it's very, it was a great insight, and I think not something that we've thought about. I think the other point about just doing a phone call is incredibly important. And actually I found that I've moved more with people that I know well, with colleagues, that we're just moving back to the phone. It's quicker. If you want to multitask, you can, and it's kind of over quicker, and you can be a bit more focused. But I think because of this falling into flexible working, we made the tech work. I think somehow we've sort of forgotten about the old-fashioned phone. So yeah, really interesting.
Yeah.
And I'd love to know if people on this call try that out.
I would add, if I could, because there's a little demo that can go with this. If you're able to be on voice and you're finding it really difficult to stay focused, you're not processing the words, and you need to get to the end of the meeting so you can actually take a break or get a snack. But the goal is just pay attention, stay present. Close your eyes. Everybody can do it right now. Just close your eyes and listen to what I'm saying. I promise you are zooming in on just the auditory stream, because the region in the back of the brain, the occipital lobe, responsible for processing vision all the time, generates and consumes 20 to 30% of your energy at all times. And you can't turn it off. We're always assessing the environment, assessing threat. But if you turn that region off, essentially, then I'm just processing auditory stimuli. So if I'm, it's 2 p.m., I'm really in a lull, I've had too much pasta, and I just need to get through the meeting, you close your eyes, and I promise you it will be way easier to attend to the relevant information and get through in a very present and focused fashion.
So one other tip that I think, so I love that idea, so I'm going to definitely use that one. But one other thing I think you can do in these contexts, which links back to what I was saying earlier in terms of building variety into your day, is to yes, get on the phone, but also get out of the house as well. So a walk and talk meeting, I think, is one of the best things that you can do to build in that variety, but also to get the blood flowing in a very different way. The other thing, which I think is really important in terms of the way that this question was posed, was it suggested that it's all about the individual. So, what can I do and what can individuals do? But the solutions to these problems are never about what the individual can do. They're all about how you can socialize the problem. So never make it about what you can do individually. Always try and think about how you can socialize that problem, which again often involves those more informal social routes than the more formal Zoom meetings that we've been talking about.
Great. Well, whilst we're on all matters practical, one of the things we said in the run-up to this seminar was we try and give kind of practical advice. So hopefully some of that is coming through. So just a reminder, if you want to ask questions as we're going, please do. There's a Q&A function at the bottom, and we'll also take a break at the end. One of the things we've committed to do is not finish exactly on the hour, but to give a bit of a breather, just in case you have indeed blocked out your diary on the hours. So we've talked about Zoom fatigue. I think it's enormously helpful, some of those practical tips. And I think as well, just reminding ourselves, we don't have to be beholden to the technology. I think this balance of technology, humanity is really important, and we possibly haven't spent quite enough time thinking about that balance. But what about the other balance? We're shifting now where we have teams split between office and home. So we know some of the big tech firms have said to people, you don't have to come in until January. I think there was a moment where it looked very forward thinking, very generous, but the question there is, well, what does now until January look like in terms of this kind of your work and your life and sense of culture? But what we're finding, we're being asked about more and more at the moment, is what do you do when some of your team are still working online and some of your team are increasingly together in the office? Or certainly we're looking forward to that over the coming months as we sort of, some offices are open at kind of 10-20% capacity, but looking to get up to 50. How do you manage meetings effectively? How do you maintain culture with some together in a room and some joining on screens or working online? Owen, perhaps you want to start with that one.
Yeah, so I think the good news in some respects is that to the point that I was making at the very beginning around changes in our routines and our practices, is that we have become more accustomed to running meetings in online environments, and also more cognizant of the challenges that can bring to employees who are part of organizations that we work within. So, I'm sure we've all been in situations before where there's been a sense of the head office or the majority of people who are engaged in a face-to-face meeting, and then one or two people dialing in through Zoom or Google Hangouts or whatever platform it might be, and then the technology breaks down. But because it's only a few people online, they're not the priority. It's the people in HQ who are able to just continue. So I think the main thing is about making sure that we are now cognizant of the fact that we're needing to be more accommodating of the fact that there are people coming in from these different routes, and that the technology is what's going to facilitate and drive the relationships that we will need to build up in these new and different ways. So I think there are some positives here as well as negatives.
Couldn't agree more. Those are all excellent points. I really believe there's an opportunity to completely change the way we meet and do work and wear all the different hats that we're supposed to wear as knowledge workers. And one idea that many firms who are looking at hybrid models and what does that even mean are thinking about is the question, how many people do we have at HQ versus people remote, or how frequently do we use headquarters and what do we use it for? And ideally, it's not every single day because it may be difficult to enforce that. People have now gotten a taste of work from home, remote. They're going to demand, or at least expect, more flexibility. So we can't push for every day. But what is also best suited for in person? It's not necessarily getting focused work done. Most people don't like open offices. It's not the best environment. If you ask anyone, here's the most important assignment. It's due at the end of the week. Where are you going to get it done? Almost no one says, oh, I'm going to go to the office and do it at a big, long table with a bunch of people around me distracted. It's never there. But second, to the point around what our office is for, they're for in-person meetings, for brainstorms, for collaboration, for building trust and relationships in person. It's way easier to do when you can see each other and touch each other and basically have the real human experience. So many firms in the pursuit of a hybrid model are thinking about how many days a week at the office, or potentially days per month, having a dedicated headquarters that serves as a nexus of social life and offsites and informal meetings and onboarding and alignment, and then for 3 days out of the week versus 2 days at the headquarters, everyone is equipped with the clear plan, deliverables we've all aligned, and now it's just execution. And you do that on your own terms, on your own time. We're focused on the output, not time in seat. So if you can do that in 2 hours or 10 hours, up to you. And then when we get back together again and we go into, okay, what's happened? What are the opportunities? What do we need to align around? What do we need to meet around? It can happen more in a batched, intentional fashion versus every day having to navigate, okay, I need to do all these things which require at least 60 minutes of focused time, but I also need to jump on Zoom, do a one-on-one, and just constantly context switch between all of these different mini jobs within our job.
That's a great point. And actually a few of the points that we've touched on there are coming up in questions. So I know one of the things that we wanted to talk about was, how what can leaders and managers do right now that will make digital working more effective? And we've been asked there about how leaders can maintain and even grow employee engagement across dispersed global teams. I guess maybe if I kick that one off and then pass over, one of the things that we've heard from across kind of private business, across government, had a great example of Director of Comms saying, the minister has never been more engaged, is actually one of the things that this has done is it's just kind of cut the space between leaders and the people. So for those businesses that quickly got onto weekly video calls, employee pre-recorded videos, Q&A sessions. Again, we did it out of crisis and on adrenaline, and in many cases it's worked incredibly well. One of the things that's happened, I think, for businesses that have done that really successfully is actually they do need to widen that gap again, because there's a role for line managers. So we know engagement research shows that people are typically, they feel much closer to their line manager. So the big strategic umbrella, absolutely from the CEO, but that kind of what's my job, what's my role, what's in it for me. So one of the things that we've been doing is more training for leaders and managers exactly around what's the science and the theory of engagement, what's happening right now to people that makes it either more difficult or potentially easier or needs to change. So I think one of the things that we can do within business is just talk actively about engaging our people and about communicating it and not seeing it as the thing that kind of happens still off at the side. Lucas or Owen, anything to add on leader engagement?
Sure. I'd love to jump in, but Owen, if I may, since I don't want this to get lost, I think you had a nugget that I wanted to ask a question about. If I may jump in, you were talking about engineering variety into your day, and not just sitting on Zoom or not just working the same way. Maybe getting outside, going for a walk. Mm. Can you speak more about the choice architecture there, where there are a lot of behaviors we now have the opportunity to do, but we may not be doing them? And it's not because we don't want to. Perhaps the choice architecture has not changed, or we haven't architected it in the right way.
So I think this is something that I think about a lot, because it's sort of fairly fundamental to the way in which a lot of solutions from a behavioral science perspective are generated. So one of the most obvious ways that you can think about designing the choice architecture, the environment and the structure of a decision-making process is to think about what the default settings are in the systems and the processes that you have in place. So one of them I mentioned, which is like ludicrously powerful in all of our lives, is the 60-minute calendarization of our lives. So one thing that I personally have been doing through lockdown, I have two young kids, is I have a default setting in my calendar every day. I have an hour and a quarter set aside for what I call my family lockdown lunch. Right? It's at the same time every day, and I make sure almost invariably that I adhere to that period. The fact that it's in my calendar as a default setting means that it almost always gets adhered to. If it's not in my diary, if I just expect it to happen, then it invariably won't. So thinking about those default settings is really important, and probably the single most effective thing that you can do if you're trying to sort of re-engineer the way that you live your working life through the lockdown and beyond.
I've got a couple more questions we're going to cover, but in the meantime, whilst we continue chatting for the next sort of 5 minutes or so, we're just going to put a poll up on the screen. I'm really interested to know, what is it that you're thinking about most, that you think you need to take back to your colleagues and your businesses? So it would be great if you could pick one of the answers. We'll share the responses with you in the email tomorrow, and if we don't get to all the questions, we will attempt to cover those off in the email. So very quick one here was around essentially, and I know Lucas, it's one of the things that we talked about previously, onboarding new people. How does that work? Lots of businesses are trying to do it now. Once the kind of pressure's off, it can be easy to think, yes, we've got a great business case, we can bring someone in, but when we can't bring them in physically, it's incredibly difficult. Even in the world of flexible working, a lot of employers will ask people to come to the physical office, certainly for the first few months, in order to build some of those relationships. So I know a couple of things that organisations are looking at is firstly, really throwing more at it than they normally would do. So more one-on-ones with more senior people, short coffees, briefing those people really well, because it's awkward. But the other thing, and interestingly, we had this at a very senior level, is who can see this person in person? You know, where do people live? Where can they get to? Actually, can we arrange a get together that's comfortable for people and feels safe? It doesn't have to be around work, to the point that Lucas made earlier. Actually, it's just about seeing each other in person, because that might make the next few meetings a little bit easier. And I think the other thing is there's a lot that we tend to pick up, even in firms that have fantastic onboarding. There's a lot that we tend to pick up just by nudging the person next to us, passing a sheet over. You look a bit confused, your colleague says, how can I help? So some of that is around formalizing it. So it might be that, as well as a buddy system that you might have, that actually you give, you know, if it's a junior person coming in, you give another junior person a really specific role to work with that person and say, you know, you can send stuff to them sight unseen and they'll comment on it in the same way as you were in the office. So I think essentially a lot of it is about doing a bit more than you normally would, and watching it a bit more closely. But Lucas, I know we touched on this in an earlier conversation. What's your views around onboarding?
Sure. I was taking a peek at the poll to see if the results came in yet. I'm so curious. Oh, there we go. Okay. We're very much in line with onboarding. I do have many thoughts here, because if people aren't rethinking every aspect of the experience, they need to start doing it now. One of the keys of onboarding is the first 30 days. What are people's experience is during that 30 days? Do they feel like people care about them? Right? That's ultimately critical to the first 30 days. Do they feel like people have noticed the work that they're doing? They're interested in getting to know them beyond just, you know, name, role, what do you do? And that can be facilitated in a variety of different ways. And the conversations I've heard focus mostly around what can people in HR, what can leaders, what can people within the business do to make someone comfortable and get them up to speed quickly and acclimate to the culture. But I want to focus on a different aspect of onboarding that we really talked about at the very beginning, which is trust. To really facilitate a quick increase in trust on the other end, people need information. They need to know about the people that they're working with. So it's not just, we need to be spending a lot of time with this person. What information do we need to give them and make clear and accessible so that they can be onboarded and do some of the onboarding on their own? And one aspect of that is, if you're on a team of 9 people or 10 people, new people, it's very easy in that first 30 days to lose the opportunity to get to know them beyond just name, you live over here, and then you start to get into a work groove. So having a centralized place with a profile of every single person in the company is an absolute necessity. There could be a video in there, but people are trying to stay professional and stay business, and we need to go in the complete opposite direction. Show your kids, what are your hobbies? What does your actual house look like if you're open to it? And just get more personal, because with so much physical distance, the amount of psychological intention and the gravity of the measures we need to take to bridge the gap and develop trust is so much greater. We actually have to take these extreme measures by giving people insight into who we are as people in as many different facets as possible. So that's onboarding without actually having to spend time with people.
Yeah, and I think there's a sense that, you know, if you think about some of the younger people coming to business, it's slightly a shock that there's all this kind of formality that's happening. And we gauged with a few clients sort of what the sense was at a sort of executive level. And interestingly, in some cases, people were saying everything feels so much easier. I feel like we're all just on a level and having conversations. But we've also heard of you know, leaders saying, actually, I feel less comfortable now. I kind of had my armor in my position and I'm not quite sure how to maintain that in this new world. And of course, I think there's a whole other seminar on that. I'm really conscious that we are at 5 to the hour. I'm sort of feeling like this is part 1 of at least 10. There's a lot more to continue talking about. I think we've covered off most of the questions, but we will review those. And if there's anything that we can put in the follow-up email, we will do that. But conscious of not wanting to be one of those people that finishes on the hour, giving you no time before your 4 p.m. or certainly UK time. I'm going to wrap up there. Huge thank you to Owen and to Lucas for sharing their expertise, their creativity and their honesty. An enormous thank you to Social Chorus, particularly to Victoria, who's picked up so much of the organisation of this, and to colleagues at Finsbury as well for making it happen. And thank you very much to all of you out there in your spare rooms and garages who've joined the conversation. We will be sending on links and notes tomorrow. You're more than welcome to send those around to colleagues who missed the session, and all of our contact details will be on there if you have further questions or want to continue the conversation. But I will leave it there for today. Thank you so much everyone for joining, and looking forward to hearing how some of those tips get implemented. Thank you everyone. Goodbye.